You know that feeling when you're about to lose everything you've worked for your entire career? That's exactly where I found myself on a cold Tuesday morning in November, sitting across from HR with a termination letter in my hands. But here's the thing, sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the best thing that ever happened to you. My name is Marcus Chen, and this is the story of how getting fired for refusing to train an incompetent CEO's niece led to the biggest corporate takedown in tech history. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. 5 years ago, I was living what most people would call the American dream. I had a corner office on the 42nd floor of the Meridian Tower in downtown Seattle, a 6-figure salary, and the respect of every engineer in the building. I was the lead systems architect at Quantum Dynamics, one of the fastest-growing fintech companies in the Pacific Northwest. But more importantly, I was the mastermind behind what would become the most revolutionary payment processing system the world had ever seen. Let me paint you a picture of how this whole mess started. It was a typical Monday morning in March when CEO Richard Blackwood called an all-hands meeting. Blackwood was one of those Silicon Valley types who wore the same black turtleneck every day and spoke in buzzwords that made your head spin. He'd built Quantum Dynamics from the ground up after selling his previous startup to Google for $2.8 billion, and he never let anyone forget it. Team, Blackwood announced from the front of our main conference room, his voice echoing off the glass walls, I'm excited to introduce you to our newest team member. This is my niece, Jessica Blackwood Martinez. She's fresh out of Stanford with a computer science degree, and she's going to be joining our core development team. I'll never forget the way Jessica walked into that room. She had this air of entitlement that you could smell from across the building. Designer clothes, expensive handbag, and the kind of confidence that only comes from knowing you'll never face real consequences for your actions. She was 22, maybe 23, with perfectly styled blonde hair and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Hi everyone, she said, waving like she was greeting fans at a parade. I'm super excited to be here and learn from all of you brilliant minds. That should have been my first red flag, but I was too focused on the project that was consuming my life to pay much attention to office politics. You see, for the past 3 years, I'd been working on something that would revolutionize how financial institutions process transactions. It wasn't just another payment app or digital wallet, it was a complete reimagining of how money moved through the global economy. The system I'd designed, codenamed Project Nexus, could process transactions at speeds that made current systems look like they were running on dial-up internet. We're talking about reducing settlement times from days to milliseconds, eliminating the need for traditional banking intermediaries, and creating a level of security that would make Fort Knox jealous. But here's the kicker, and this is where things get interesting. I'd built something into the system that nobody else knew about. Call it insurance, call it paranoia, but I'd learned early in my career that in the tech world, you never know when someone's going to try to steal your work or push you out. Every line of code, every algorithm, every breakthrough innovation in Project Nexus was tied to a series of encrypted keys that only I possessed. Not just password protection, we're talking about quantum encrypted, multi-layered security that would take a supercomputer 1,000 years to crack. The system would run, sure, but without my keys, it was essentially a very expensive paperweight. The week after Jessica's arrival, my direct supervisor, Sarah Montenegro, called me into her office. Sarah was a good manager, fair, direct, and one of the few people at Quantum Dynamics who'd actually worked her way up from the bottom. She'd started as a junior developer and had the battle scars to prove it. Marcus, she said, closing her office door behind me, I need to talk to you about something, and I want you to hear me out before you react. I settled into the chair across from her desk, already sensing where this conversation was headed. What's up, Sarah? Richard wants you to take Jessica under your wing. Show her the ropes, get her up to speed on our development processes. Sarah paused, studying my face. He specifically mentioned Project Nexus. The blood drained from my face. Project Nexus wasn't just confidential, it was the crown jewel of our entire company. We'd invested $47 million in development costs alone, not counting the countless hours of research and testing. The intellectual property contained in that system was worth more than some small country's GDP. Sarah, you know I can't do that. Jessica doesn't have the security clearance, the experience, or frankly, the competence to work on Nexus. She's been here less than a week. Sarah held up her hand. I know, Marcus. I know. But this is coming from the top. Richard specifically requested that she be brought onto the Nexus team. I leaned back in my chair, trying to process what I was hearing. Has she even demonstrated basic coding competency? Has anyone tested her skills? That's where it gets complicated, Sarah said, lowering her voice. I asked Tom Rodriguez in HR to run her through our standard technical assessment. You know Tom, he's fair but thorough. He's been doing our technical interviews for 8 years. Tom Rodriguez was our head of technical recruiting, and he had a reputation for being absolutely ruthless when it came to evaluating candidates. He turned down MIT graduates who couldn't solve basic algorithmic problems. If Tom had tested Jessica, I knew the results would be telling. What did Tom find? I asked. Sarah pulled out a file folder and slid it across her desk. I probably shouldn't be showing you this, but I think you need to understand what we're dealing with. I opened the folder and found Jessica's technical assessment results. What I saw made my stomach drop. Out of a possible 100 points, Jessica had scored a 23. To put that in perspective, we typically wouldn't even consider candidates who scored below 70. The average intern scored around 80. The assessment showed that Jessica struggled with basic programming concepts, couldn't explain fundamental algorithms, and had apparently never worked with any of the programming languages we used at Quantum Dynamics. When asked to write a simple function to sort an array, she'd submitted code that wouldn't even compile. Sarah, this is insane. She can't even write basic code, and Richard wants me to bring her onto the most sensitive project in company history. I know how it looks, Marcus. But Richard was very clear. He said that Jessica has tremendous potential and that working on Nexus would be a great learning experience for her. I stood up, pacing to the window that overlooked the Seattle skyline. 42 floors below, the city bustled with activity, people going about their lives, completely unaware that decisions made in corporate boardrooms could change everything they thought they knew about money and technology. Sarah, I need you to understand something. Project Nexus isn't just another software project. The code I've written contains breakthrough algorithms that could revolutionize global finance. We're talking about a system that could process the entire world's financial transactions more efficiently than anything that currently exists. I turned back to face her. The security implications alone are staggering. If someone with Jessica's level of competence gets access to this system and makes a mistake, we could be looking at a security breach that makes Equifax look like a minor inconvenience. Sarah nodded slowly. I understand your concerns, Marcus. I really do. But Richard has made his decision. He wants Jessica on the Nexus team, and he wants you to train her personally. What about the other senior developers? What about bringing in someone from our security team to supervise? He specifically requested you. Said you're the best teacher in the company and that Jessica would benefit from your expertise. I felt a knot forming in my stomach. There was something about this whole situation that didn't add up. Richard Blackwood was many things, but he wasn't stupid. He'd built a multi-billion-dollar company by making smart decisions and surrounding himself with competent people. Why would he suddenly want to place his inexperienced niece on the most critical project in company history? Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Is there something else going on here? Some reason why Richard is pushing so hard for Jessica to be involved with Nexus? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her wrestling with something internally. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus, I probably shouldn't tell you this, but there have been some conversations at the executive level about the future of Project Nexus. Some discussions about potentially licensing the technology or bringing in outside partners. My blood ran cold. What kind of outside partners? I don't know the details, but I've heard mentions of some major financial institutions showing interest. Wells Fargo, JP Morgan Chase, even some international banks. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. Richard wasn't trying to give his niece a learning experience, he was trying to give her access to the most valuable intellectual property in the company. If Quantum Dynamics was planning to license or sell the Nexus technology, having someone with intimate knowledge of the system could be incredibly valuable, but here's what Richard didn't know, and what I was about to make very clear: Project Nexus wasn't just company property. The core algorithms, the breakthrough innovations, the revolutionary approaches to transaction processing, all of that came from my brain, my research, my years of working 18-hour days. Sarah, I need you to understand something. I'm not going to train Jessica on Project Nexus. I can't, in good conscience, give someone with her level of incompetence access to technology that could reshape the global economy. Sarah's face went pale. Marcus, I don't think you understand. This isn't a request. This is a direct order from the CEO. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Then the CEO is going to be disappointed, I said, heading toward the door. Because I'm not doing it. Over the next 2 weeks, the pressure intensified. Richard Blackwood himself called me into his office, a massive corner suite that took up half of the 45th floor. The walls were covered with awards, patents, and photos of Richard with various tech luminaries and politicians. His desk was a slab of black granite that probably cost more than most people's cars. "Marcus," Richard said, not bothering to look up from his computer screen, "I understand you have some concerns about bringing Jessica onto the Nexus team." "That's correct, sir. I have significant concerns about bringing someone with her level of experience onto such a sensitive project." Richard finally looked up at me, and I could see the calculation in his eyes. He was trying to figure out how to handle this situation without revealing too much about his true motivations. "Jessica may be young, but she's brilliant. She graduated summa cum laude from Stanford with a degree in computer science. She's exactly the kind of fresh perspective we need on this project. Sir, with all due respect, I've seen her technical assessment scores. She scored a 23 out of 100. That's not a fresh perspective, that's a liability." Richard's jaw tightened. "Assessment scores don't tell the whole story, Marcus. Sometimes the most innovative minds don't perform well on standardized tests." I knew I was walking into dangerous territory, but I couldn't let this go. "Mr. Blackwood, Project Nexus represents 3 years of my life and $47 million of company investment. The algorithms contained in that system are revolutionary. Giving access to someone who can't write basic code would be like handing the keys to a Formula One race car to someone who just got their learner's permit. Are you questioning my judgment, Marcus?" "I'm questioning the wisdom of this decision." "Yes, sir." Richard stood up, his 6'3" frame towering over his desk. "Let me make something very clear to you, Marcus. Jessica Blackwood Martinez is going to be trained on Project Nexus, and you're going to be the one to train her. This is not a debate, it's not a discussion, and it's not a request. It's a direct order. And if I refuse? Then you'll need to find another job." The silence in that office was deafening. I could hear the hum of the air conditioning, the distant sound of traffic from the street below, and the rhythmic ticking of an expensive clock on Richard's bookshelf. Everything I'd worked for, everything I'd built, was hanging in the balance. "I need some time to think about this," I said finally. "You have until tomorrow morning to make your decision," Richard replied, already turning his attention back to his computer screen. "But let me be clear, if you choose to leave, you'll be bound by the non-compete clause in your contract. You won't be able to work for any competing company for 2 years." As I walked out of Richard's office, my mind was racing. The non-compete clause he'd mentioned was real, and it was ironclad. Our legal team had crafted it specifically to prevent senior engineers from leaving and taking valuable knowledge to competitors. If I quit or was fired, I'd be effectively blacklisted from the tech industry for 2 years, but Richard had made one crucial mistake. He'd assumed that I needed quantum dynamics more than quantum dynamics needed me. He'd forgotten that Project Nexus wasn't just company property, it was my creation, my innovation, my life's work. And I'd been very careful to protect it. That night, I sat in my apartment overlooking Elliott Bay, staring at my laptop screen. On it was the master code repository for Project Nexus, hundreds of thousands of lines of code, complex algorithms, and revolutionary innovations that could change the world. But more importantly, it was all encrypted with keys that only I possessed. I opened a secure communication channel and began typing a message to my friend David Kim, a patent attorney who specialized in intellectual property law. David and I had gone to college together, and he'd helped me navigate the legal complexities of working in the tech industry. "David," I wrote, "I need to talk to you about something urgent. Can we meet tomorrow?" His response came back within minutes. "Of course. My office at 2 p.m.? As I closed my laptop and prepared for bed, I had no idea that my decision would set in motion a chain of events that would bring down one of the most powerful tech companies in the world. But sometimes, when you're pushed into a corner, the only way out is to push back harder than anyone expects. The next morning, I walked into Quantum Dynamics knowing it would be my last day as an employee. But I also knew it would be the first day of something much bigger, something that would change not just my life, but the entire landscape of financial technology. Richard Blackwood thought he was calling my bluff. He thought he could intimidate me into compliance, force me to hand over my life's work to his incompetent niece, and then push me aside when it was convenient. He was about to learn that some people don't bluff. I walked into the office that Wednesday morning with a strange sense of calm. My meeting with David Kim the previous afternoon had been enlightening in ways I hadn't expected. As I sat across from him in his downtown law office, surrounded by legal books and framed patents, he'd asked me a question that changed everything. "Marcus, when you developed these algorithms for Project Nexus, did you do any of the work on your own time? Using your own equipment?" The question hit me like a lightning bolt. "Actually, yes. Most of the breakthrough innovations happened during weekends and evenings when I was working from home. I used my personal laptop, my own development environment. David leaned forward, his eyes lighting up. And do you have documentation of this? Timestamps, version control logs, anything that proves when and where you developed the core technology? I nodded slowly. I keep meticulous records. Every commit, every breakthrough, every late-night coding session is documented with timestamps and location data. Marcus, you might have more leverage than you think. Under Washington state law, if you developed intellectual property on your own time using your own resources, the company's claim to that IP becomes much more complicated. That conversation was playing in my head as I badged into the Quantum Dynamics building for what I knew would be the last time as an employee. The security guard, Frank, gave me his usual morning nod. He'd been working the front desk for 12 years and knew every employee by name. Morning, Mr. Chen. Big day today? If only he knew. Something like that, Frank. I made my way to the elevator, pressing the button for the 42nd floor. The ride up gave me time to think about what was about to happen. Richard Blackwood expected me to cave, to prioritize my job security over my principles. He'd calculated that the threat of unemployment and the non-compete clause would be enough to force my compliance. What he didn't know was that I'd spent the previous evening preparing for nuclear warfare. My first stop was my office, where I methodically began documenting everything. I opened my encrypted external drive and began copying files, not company code, but my personal development logs, research notes, and documentation that proved the timeline of my innovations. Every keystroke was calculated, every file transfer purposeful. Then I opened a secure email account I'd created years earlier but never used. It was registered under a pseudonym, routed through multiple VPN layers, and completely untraceable to me. I began drafting a series of emails that would remain in the drafts folder until I decided to send them. At exactly 9 a.m., my phone buzzed with a calendar reminder, meeting with Richard Blackwood, final decision. I grabbed my laptop bag, made sure my encrypted drive was secure, and headed to the elevator. As the doors closed, I caught a glimpse of Jessica Blackwood Martinez strutting down the hallway in what looked like a $3,000 designer outfit. She was talking loudly on her phone about some party she'd attended over the weekend, completely oblivious to the gravity of what was about to unfold. Richard's office felt different this time. The morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows cast long shadows across the room, and the city of Seattle spread out below us like a circuit board. Richard was standing with his back to me, apparently taking a phone call. Yes, I understand the timeline is aggressive, but we need to move quickly on this, he was saying. The sooner we can get the technology transferred, the better positioned we'll be for the acquisition talks. Acquisition talks. My blood went cold. Richard wasn't just planning to exploit my technology, he was planning to sell the entire company, with Project Nexus as the crown jewel. He ended his call and turned to face me. Marcus, I trust you've made the right decision. I have indeed made a decision, Mr. Blackwood. But I don't think it's the one you're expecting. His confident smile faltered slightly. I'm sorry. I will not be training your niece on Project Nexus. I will not be giving her access to proprietary algorithms that took me 3 years to develop. And I will not be complicit in what appears to be a plan to sell off company assets for personal gain. The silence that followed was electric. Richard's face went through a fascinating transformation: surprise, anger, calculation, and finally, cold fury. You're making a very serious mistake, Marcus. No, Mr. Blackwood. I'm correcting one. You see, I had an interesting conversation with my attorney yesterday. It turns out that when you develop breakthrough technology on your own time, using your own equipment, the intellectual property laws become much more complex. Richard's eyes narrowed. What exactly are you saying? I'm saying that the core algorithms that make Project Nexus revolutionary were developed by me, on my own time, using my own resources. I have documentation proving this. Timestamps, development logs, version control records, everything needed to establish independent ownership of the intellectual property. The color drained from Richard's face. That's impossible. You were hired to develop that technology for this company. I was hired to work on financial systems, yes. But the specific breakthrough innovations that make Nexus unique were developed during my personal research time. And under Washington state law, that creates a very different legal situation. Richard moved behind his desk, his hands gripping the granite surface so tightly his knuckles went white. Even if that were true, which I doubt, you signed a comprehensive employment agreement. Everything you develop while working here belongs to the company. I pulled out my phone and opened the voice recording app, making sure Richard could see what I was doing. Actually, Mr. Blackwood, employment agreements can't supersede state intellectual property laws. And they certainly can't claim ownership of work that was done independently. What are you doing? Richard demanded, staring at my phone. I'm documenting this conversation for legal purposes. I want to make sure there's a clear record of what happens next. Richard's jaw clenched. Turn that off immediately. I don't think so. You see, I have reason to believe that you're planning to sell Quantum Dynamics, with Project Nexus as the primary asset. The phone call you were taking when I walked in was quite illuminating. You have no idea what you're talking about. Goldman Sachs, right? Or was it Morgan Stanley handling the acquisition talks? Either way, you're planning to cash out using technology that I developed, and then you're planning to cut me out of the equation entirely. Richard's face was now completely red. You're being paranoid and ridiculous. Am I? Then explain why you're so desperate to get your incompetent niece access to the most sensitive project in company history. Explain why someone who scored 23 out of 100 on a basic technical assessment suddenly needs to understand revolutionary financial algorithms. Jessica is a qualified engineer. Jessica couldn't code her way out of a paper bag, I interrupted. But she could serve as a perfect front person for technology transfer. Give her just enough knowledge to make it look like she contributed to the development, and suddenly the Blackwood family has a legitimate claim to the intellectual property. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard's expression told me everything I needed to know. I'd hit the bullseye. You're fired, Richard said quietly. I expected as much. Security will escort you out immediately. You have 5 minutes to collect your personal belongings. That won't be necessary. I don't have any personal belongings here that I need. Richard pressed a button on his desk, and within seconds, 2 security guards appeared at his office door. But instead of the usual corporate security team, these were professionals I'd never seen before, the kind of people who looked like they'd stepped out of a government facility. Gentlemen, please escort Mr. Chen to his office to collect his belongings, then to the exit. Make sure he doesn't access any company systems or remove any company property. As we walked toward the elevator, I could feel the eyes of my colleagues on me. Word traveled fast in an office building, and by now, everyone knew something dramatic was happening. Sarah Montenegro caught my eye from across the floor, her expression a mixture of concern and fear. The elevator ride to my floor was surreal. The 2 security guards flanked me like I was some kind of corporate criminal, while I stood there knowing that I held cards they couldn't even imagine. Gentlemen, I said conversationally, I hope you're being well compensated for this assignment. Because in about 6 months, there's a good chance this company won't exist anymore. One of the guards glanced at me with curiosity, but neither responded. My office felt different now, smaller, somehow. The awards on the wall, the technical books on the shelves, the whiteboard covered with complex algorithms, all of it belonged to a different life, a life that had ended the moment I refused to compromise my principles. I grabbed my coffee mug, a small cactus plant, and a photo of my parents. Everything else could stay. The guards watched carefully as I opened each desk drawer, presumably to make sure I wasn't palming any USB drives or confidential documents. What they didn't know was that everything I needed was already safely stored in multiple encrypted locations, completely inaccessible to Quantum Dynamics or anyone else without my specific authorization keys. As we walked toward the exit, I saw Jessica Blackwood Martinez standing near the reception desk, apparently waiting for someone. She looked up as we passed, and I could see the smugness in her expression. She thought she'd won, that her uncle's power and influence had cleared the path for her to access technology worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Good luck with Project Nexus, I said to her as we passed. She smiled condescendingly. Thanks. I'm sure I'll figure it out. If only she knew what she was about to discover. The walk through the lobby felt like a perp walk. Frank the security guard looked confused and concerned, but he didn't say anything as the corporate security team escorted me past his desk and out the front door. As I stood on the sidewalk outside Quantum Dynamics, breathing the crisp Seattle air, I pulled out my phone and sent a single text message to David Kim. It's done. They took the bait. His response came back immediately. Phase 2. Phase 2, I confirmed. What Richard Blackwood didn't understand was that firing me wasn't the end of his problems, it was the beginning. Because Project Nexus wasn't just secured with standard encryption. It was built with a dead man switch. A failsafe that I'd incorporated into the core architecture from the very beginning. The system would continue to function normally for exactly 72 hours after my access credentials were revoked. After that, without my personal authorization keys, the entire system would begin a cascading shutdown sequence. Not a dramatic explosion or obvious sabotage, just a gradual degradation of performance that would become increasingly obvious to anyone trying to use the technology. And there was something else Richard didn't know. Over the past 3 years, as I'd developed Project Nexus, I'd also been developing something else, a competing system that incorporated all the same breakthrough innovations, but with even more advanced capabilities. This parallel system was stored entirely on my personal servers, documented with my personal development logs, and completely independent of anything owned by Quantum Dynamics. I called it Project Phoenix, and it was about to rise from the ashes of my former career. As I walked away from the Quantum Dynamics building, I pulled out my secure phone and opened the encrypted email account I'd set up. In the drafts folder were 12 carefully crafted messages, each one addressed to a different recipient. Financial journalists at the Wall Street Journal and TechCrunch. Patent attorneys specializing in intellectual property disputes. Former colleagues who'd left Quantum Dynamics under suspicious circumstances. And most importantly, senior executives at 3 major financial institutions who'd been quietly inquiring about licensing revolutionary transaction processing technology. I selected all 12 emails and moved them from drafts to the outbox. By the time Richard Blackwood realized what was happening, it would be too late. The 72-hour countdown had begun, and Jessica Blackwood Martinez was about to discover that some knowledge can't be stolen, it has to be earned. As I disappeared into the Seattle crowd, I couldn't help but smile. Richard thought he was playing chess, but I'd been playing 4-dimensional chess for 3 years. He'd just made his final move, and he didn't even know the game was already over. The real story was just beginning. 3 hours after being escorted out of Quantum Dynamics, I was sitting in a small coffee shop in Capitol Hill, watching the news break in real time. My secure phone buzzed with incoming responses to the emails I'd sent, but I ignored them for now. There was something more important I needed to witness. Inside the Quantum Dynamics building, Jessica Blackwood Martinez was about to have her first day working on Project Nexus. According to the intelligence I'd gathered from sympathetic colleagues still inside the company, she'd been given full access to the development environment and was being briefed by the remaining senior engineers. What she didn't know was that every keystroke she made, every command she entered, was being logged by systems I'd built into the architecture years ago. Not for surveillance, but for security auditing. Now those logs were being forwarded to an encrypted server that only I could access. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from Tom Rodriguez, the HR director who'd conducted Jessica's disastrous technical assessment. Tom had been one of the few executives who'd tried to maintain some integrity in the company's hiring practices, and he'd been increasingly uncomfortable with the nepotism he was witnessing. Emergency meeting called for 4 p.m. Something about Nexus system anomalies. Thought you should know. I checked my watch. 3:47 p.m. The 72-hour countdown had begun exactly 4 hours and 23 minutes ago. Right on schedule, the first phase of the dead man switch was activating. The beauty of the system I designed was its subtlety. Phase 1 wouldn't cause any obvious failures or dramatic shutdowns. Instead, it would introduce microscopic delays into transaction processing times, delays so small that they would be almost imperceptible during normal testing, but would compound exponentially under load. Jessica and her new team were about to discover that Project Nexus, the revolutionary system that was supposed to process transactions in milliseconds, was suddenly taking 3 to 4 seconds per transaction. For a financial system, that might as well be an eternity. My secure phone rang. The caller ID showed David Kim's office number. Marcus, we need to talk immediately. Can you get to my office? 20 minutes later, I was back in David's law office. But this time the atmosphere was electric with urgency. David had printed out copies of all the emails I'd sent, and his desk was covered with legal documents, patent filings, and what looked like corporate acquisition paperwork. Marcus, do you realize what you've started? I've been getting calls for the past 2 hours from some of the most powerful law firms in the country. Good or bad calls? Both. 3 different firms want to represent you in what they're calling the intellectual property case of the decade. But I also got a very aggressive call from Quantum Dynamics' legal team. They're claiming you've violated your employment agreement and are threatening criminal charges for corporate sabotage. I leaned back in my chair, feeling remarkably calm despite the chaos swirling around me. Let me guess, they discovered the system performance issues. How could you possibly know that? Because I designed it to happen. David, what I'm about to tell you needs to stay between us until we're ready to make it public. The performance degradation they're experiencing isn't sabotage, it's a security feature I built into the system to prevent unauthorized use. David's eyes widened. Explain. When I developed the core algorithms for Project Nexus, I incorporated what's essentially a biometric authentication system. The system requires periodic validation from the original developer, me, to maintain optimal performance. Without that validation, it automatically begins implementing security protocols. that progressively limit functionality. Is that legal? It's not only legal, it's standard practice in high-security software development. The military uses similar systems, as do major financial institutions. If someone tries to use the software without proper authorization, it protects itself. David was furiously taking notes. And you documented this feature? Extensively. Every line of code is commented, every security protocol is documented, and every design decision is logged with timestamps proving when and why I implemented these features. My phone buzzed with another text message, this one from Sarah Montenegro. Jessica locked out of Nexus system. Claims she can't access core functions. Richard calling emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning. I showed the message to David, who whistled softly. Phase 2. Phase 2, I confirmed, the second phase of the dead man switch was designed to activate 24 hours after credential revocation. This phase would begin restricting access to critical system functions, essentially turning Project Nexus into a very expensive piece of display software. Users could see the interface, they could access basic functions, but they couldn't perform any meaningful operations. David, I need you to prepare something for me. I want to file a preliminary injunction to prevent Quantum Dynamics from using Project Nexus technology without proper licensing agreements. On what grounds? Intellectual property theft, unauthorized use of proprietary algorithms, and violation of software licensing agreements. David looked confused. What licensing agreements? I pulled out my laptop and opened a folder that contained dozens of legal documents. Every piece of breakthrough technology one developed for Project Nexus was released under a custom license agreement that I filed with the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. The license allows Quantum Dynamics to use the technology, but only while I remain employed by the company and only for the specific purposes outlined in the agreement. Marcus, you're telling me that you've essentially been licensing your own technology to your employer? Exactly. And as of this morning, when they terminated my employment without cause, that license agreement became null and void. David stared at the documents I'd handed him, his expression shifting from confusion to amazement to something approaching awe. This is brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. You've essentially created a legal framework that makes it impossible for them to use your technology without your permission. It gets better. Remember those acquisition talks I overheard? I did some research this afternoon. Quantum Dynamics has been in negotiations with Meridian Financial for the past 6 months. The acquisition is valued at $850 million, and the primary asset driving that valuation is Project Nexus, which they can't legally use without your permission. Which they can't use at all, period. The dead man switch will render the system completely inoperable within 72 hours of my termination. David leaned back in his chair, a slow smile spreading across his face. Marcus, do you realize what you've done? You've essentially created a situation where one of the largest fintech companies in the Pacific Northwest is about to discover that their most valuable asset is worthless. Not worthless, I corrected. Unavailable to them. But very much available to someone else. Someone else? I opened another folder on my laptop, this one containing the complete technical specifications for Project Phoenix. While I was developing Nexus for Quantum Dynamics, I was also developing a parallel system on my own time. Phoenix incorporates all the same breakthrough innovations as Nexus, but with significant improvements and enhancements. David's jaw dropped. You developed 2 revolutionary financial processing systems simultaneously? Phoenix is actually more advanced than Nexus. It's faster, more secure, and includes features that Nexus doesn't have. The best part? Phoenix is entirely my intellectual property, developed on my own time using my own resources, with complete documentation proving independent development. And you're planning to license Phoenix to the highest bidder. I've already been in preliminary discussions with several major financial institutions. Wells Fargo, Chase, Bank of America, they're all interested in revolutionary transaction processing technology. My phone rang again. This time it was an unknown number with a 212 area code, New York. Mr. Chen? This is Elizabeth Warren, not the senator, the other one. I'm a partner at Sterling, Blackstone and Associates. We represent several major financial institutions, and we understand you may have some technology that our clients would be very interested in licensing. That's correct. We'd like to schedule a meeting as soon as possible. Our clients are prepared to move very quickly on the right opportunity. I looked at David, who was listening to the conversation with obvious excitement. I can be in New York tomorrow afternoon. Excellent. We'll send a car to pick you up at LaGuardia. After I hung up, David was practically vibrating with energy. Marcus, do you understand what's happening here? You're about to turn getting fired into the biggest business opportunity of your career. It gets better. I've been monitoring the situation at Quantum Dynamics through, let's call them sympathetic sources. Jessica Blackwood Martinez spent the entire afternoon trying to access Project Nexus, and she's been completely unable to perform any meaningful functions. How is Richard handling this? According to my sources, he's been on the phone with the company's technical team all afternoon, demanding explanations for why the system suddenly isn't working. Nobody can figure out what's wrong because nobody else understands the architecture well enough to diagnose the security protocols. David pulled up a news website on his computer. Marcus, look at this. The headline read, Quantum Dynamics stock drops 12% in after-hours trading following reports of technical difficulties. The market is already reacting, David said. Word is getting out that there are problems with their flagship technology. I felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Quantum Dynamics had been my professional home for 5 years. I genuinely believed in the company's mission and had worked incredibly hard to help build something revolutionary. But Richard Blackwood's greed and nepotism had poisoned everything. David, there's something else you need to know. I've been documenting everything that's happened over the past few weeks. Richard's insistence on giving Jessica access to Nexus, the overheard acquisition talks, the threats he made when I refused to comply. I have recordings, emails, and witness statements that paint a very clear picture of what was really happening. What kind of picture? Corporate fraud. Richard was planning to use his niece as a front to legitimize his family's claim to technology they didn't develop. Then he was going to sell the company, cashing out for hundreds of millions of dollars, using intellectual property that wasn't legally his to sell. David's expression turned serious. Marcus, if you can prove that, we're not just talking about an intellectual property dispute. We're talking about securities fraud, corporate misconduct, and potentially criminal charges. I can prove it. The question is, how far do we want to take this? Before David could answer, my phone buzzed with a text from Tom Rodriguez, board. Meeting moved to 8 p.m. tonight. Richard called in lawyers from 3 different firms. Something big is happening. I showed the message to David. They're panicking. Richard probably just realized that the $850 million acquisition deal is in jeopardy. What's your next move? I stood up and walked to David's window, looking out at the Seattle skyline. Somewhere in that maze of buildings, Richard Blackwood was probably having the worst day of his professional life. His $850 million payday was evaporating in real time. His niece was proving to be exactly as incompetent as her technical assessment had indicated. And his most valuable employee had just walked out the door with the keys to the kingdom. My next move is to let them stew in their own panic for another 24 hours. Phase 3 of the Dead Man's Switch activates tomorrow evening. After that, Project Nexus will become completely inoperable. And then? Then I fly to New York and start fielding offers for Project Phoenix. By the time Richard figures out what's really happening, I'll be negotiating licensing deals worth more than his entire company. David gathered up the documents scattered across his desk. Marcus, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Are you absolutely certain that everything you've done is legal? David, I've been planning for this possibility for 3 years. Every move I've made, every system I've built, every document I've filed, it's all been designed to protect my intellectual property and ensure that I maintain control over my own innovations. And you're confident that Project Phoenix is entirely your intellectual property? Completely confident. I have development logs going back 2.5 years, all timestamped and location verified. I have documentation proving that I used my own equipment, my own development environment, and my own time. I even have utility bills showing the increased electricity usage at my apartment during the periods when I was doing intensive development work. David nodded slowly. Okay. I believe you. But Marcus, what you're about to do is going to make a lot of very powerful people very angry. Are you prepared for the fight that's coming? I turned back to face him, and for the first time in months, I felt genuinely optimistic about the future. David, I've been preparing for this fight for 3 years. Richard Blackwood thought he could intimidate me into giving up everything I'd worked for. He thought he could use his niece to steal my technology and then push me aside. I picked up my laptop and headed toward the door. He was wrong. And by tomorrow night, the entire tech industry is going to know exactly how wrong he was. As I left David's office, I could hear him on the phone, already setting up the legal machinery that would protect my interests in the days to come. But I wasn't worried about legal battles or corporate warfare. I was thinking about something much more satisfying. In exactly 41 hours and 17 minutes, Richard Blackwood was going to discover that some mistakes can't be undone. And Jessica Blackwood Martinez was going to learn that nepotism is no substitute for competence. The countdown was accelerating, and there was no way to stop it. I woke up the next morning to 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. The first call was from a number I didn't recognize, but when I answered, the voice on the other end made my blood run cold. Marcus Chen? This is Rebecca Harrison from the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division. We need to talk. My mind immediately went to the worst-case scenarios. Had Richard somehow convinced federal investigators that I was engaged in corporate sabotage? Had someone at Quantum Dynamics filed criminal charges? Agent Harrison, I'm happy to cooperate, but I should mention that I'm represented by counsel. Mr. Chen, you're not under investigation. We're calling because someone filed a complaint yesterday alleging securities fraud and corporate misconduct. At Quantum Dynamics. Your name came up as a potential witness. I sat up straighter. Someone had beaten me to the punch. Who filed the complaint? I can't discuss the details over the phone, but we'd like to schedule an interview. Are you available? This afternoon? After hanging up with Agent Harrison, I immediately called David Kim. He answered on the first ring, and I could hear the exhaustion in his voice. Marcus, thank God you called. I've been fielding calls since 5 a.m. Something happened at Quantum Dynamics last night that's got everyone in a panic. What kind of something? According to my sources, the emergency board meeting went until 3 a.m. Richard tried to convince the board that the system issues were temporary and could be resolved quickly. But then something happened that changed everything. What? Jessica Blackwood Martinez had a complete meltdown in front of the entire board. Apparently, she was supposed to demonstrate her understanding of Project Nexus technology, but she couldn't even explain basic programming concepts, let alone revolutionary financial algorithms. I felt a grim satisfaction. The technical incompetence I'd been trying to warn everyone about had finally been exposed at the highest levels of the company. It gets worse, David continued. One of the board members, Dr. Patricia Williams, the former MIT computer science dean, started asking Jessica detailed questions about the Nexus architecture. Jessica not only couldn't answer them, she apparently started crying and accused Dr. Williams of being mean to her. In front of the entire board. In front of the entire board, 3 teams of lawyers, and a stenographer who was recording everything for legal purposes. Then Richard made the mistake of trying to defend Jessica by claiming she was still learning the system, and Dr. Williams pointed out that anyone with a legitimate computer science degree from Stanford should be able to discuss basic algorithmic concepts. I pulled up my laptop and checked the Quantum Dynamics stock price. It had dropped another 8% overnight and was continuing to fall in pre-market trading. David, there's something else. I just got a call from the FBI. Someone filed a complaint about securities fraud at Quantum Dynamics. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Marcus, I need to tell you something. After you left yesterday, I spent the evening reviewing all the evidence you've gathered. The recordings, the emails, the documentation of Richard's threats, it's all extremely compelling evidence of corporate misconduct. You filed the complaint. I felt I had an ethical obligation. Marcus, what Richard was planning to do wasn't just unethical, it was potentially criminal. Using his niece to establish fraudulent ownership of intellectual property, then selling the company based on assets he knew he didn't legally control, that's textbook securities fraud. My phone buzzed with an incoming text from Tom Rodriguez, Nexus system completely down. All functions locked. Jessica was accused of breaking it. Richard is bringing in an outside forensics team. Phase 3 was activated right on schedule. David, the system just went into complete lockdown mode. Quantum Dynamics no longer has access to any Nexus functionality. Is that part of your dead man switch? The final phase. As of this moment, Project Nexus is completely inoperable. Even if they brought me back and begged me to fix it, the system would need to be completely rebuilt from the ground up. Marcus, you need to get over here immediately. We have a problem. An hour later, I was back in David's office, but this time we weren't alone. Sitting across from David's desk was a woman in her 50s wearing a crisp business suit and an expression that could cut glass. Marcus, this is Amanda Foster from the Securities and Exchange Commission. She's been investigating unusual trading activity in Quantum Dynamics stock. Amanda Foster opened a folder filled with financial documents and trading records. Mr. Chen, we have evidence that someone with inside knowledge of Quantum Dynamics has been shorting the company's stock for the past several weeks. The trades were perfectly timed to coincide with the technical difficulties that began yesterday. My stomach dropped. You think I'm involved in insider trading? I think someone knew exactly when and how Quantum Dynamics was going to experience catastrophic technical failures. The question is whether that someone was engaging in illegal market manipulation. David leaned forward. Amanda, my client has been completely transparent about his actions. He developed security protocols to protect his intellectual property, and those protocols were documented and legally justified. Mr. Kim, your client's intellectual property claims may be legitimate, but if he used advanced knowledge of system failures to profit from stock trades, we have a very different situation. I pulled out my phone and opened my brokerage app, showing the screen to Amanda Foster. Ms. Foster, I think you'll find that I don't own any Quantum Dynamics stock, I've never shorted the company's stock, and I have no financial positions that would benefit from the company's difficulties. She studied my phone screen carefully, then made some notes in her folder. Then who has been shorting the stock? David and I exchanged glances. We both knew the answer, but proving it would be more complicated. Miss Foster, I said carefully, I think you need to investigate trading activity by Meridian Financial and their associates. Quantum Dynamics has been in acquisition talks with Meridian for months, and those talks would have given Meridian detailed access to information about Project Nexus. You're suggesting that Meridian discovered the technical issues and used that knowledge to manipulate the stock price? I'm suggesting that Meridian may have realized that the acquisition they were planning was based on technology that Quantum Dynamics doesn't actually own. If they discovered that the core intellectual property belongs to me rather than the company, they would have known that the $850 million acquisition was essentially worthless. Amanda Foster closed her folder and stood up. Mr. Chen, I'll need you to remain available for further questioning. This investigation is expanding beyond what we initially thought. After she left, David and I sat in silence for several minutes. The situation was becoming more complex by the hour, with new players and new allegations emerging constantly. David, I need to ask you something. How bad could this get for me? Honestly? If we can prove that everything you did was legal and that you weren't engaged in market manipulation, you'll probably come out of this as a hero. But if the SEC decides that your actions constituted illegal market manipulation, you could be looking at serious criminal charges. My phone rang. The caller ID showed a New York number, the law firm representing the financial institutions interested in Project Phoenix. Mr. Chen, this is Elizabeth Warren from Sterling, Blackstone and Associates. We need to postpone our meeting. Our clients are concerned about the federal investigations surrounding Quantum Dynamics, and they want to wait until the legal situation is resolved before proceeding with any technology licensing discussions. After I hung up, David shook his head. The investigation is scaring off potential business partners. We need to resolve this quickly. What do you recommend? Full cooperation with all investigations, complete transparency about your actions and motivations, and we need to gather additional evidence that proves your innocence of any market manipulation. My phone buzzed with another text, this one from Sarah Montenegro. Richard just fired Jessica. Told board she was clearly not qualified for the position. Board demanding his resignation. Merger talks with Meridian officially terminated. I showed the message to David, who let out a low whistle. It's all falling apart faster than anyone expected. There's something else, I said, opening my laptop. I've been monitoring network traffic from Quantum Dynamics since yesterday. Someone has been trying to break into the Nexus system using brute force attacks. Richard's forensics team. No, this is coming from outside the company. The IP addresses trace back to a server farm in Delaware that's registered to Meridian Financial. David's eyes widened. They're trying to steal the technology. They're trying to bypass my security protocols and gain unauthorized access to the system. Which, ironically, proves that they knew the technology didn't belong to Quantum Dynamics. Marcus, this changes everything. If Meridian was attempting to steal technology they knew was illegally obtained, it supports your version of events and undermines any suggestion that you were engaged in market manipulation. I spent the next hour documenting the attempted intrusion, capturing screenshots and network logs that clearly showed unauthorized access attempts from Meridian Financial servers. The evidence was damning. It proved that Meridian had known about the intellectual property issues and had tried to steal the technology when the legal acquisition fell through. At 3 p.m., my phone rang again. This time it was Agent Harrison from the FBI. Mr. Chen, we've arrested Richard Blackwood on charges of securities fraud and conspiracy to commit intellectual property theft. We'd like you to come in and provide a formal statement. What about Jessica Blackwood Martinez? Ms. Blackwood Martinez is being treated as a victim in this case. Our investigation indicates that she was manipulated by her uncle and was unaware of the illegal nature of his plans. 2 hours later, I was sitting in a federal building downtown, providing a detailed statement to FBI agents about everything that had happened over the past month. I handed over recordings, emails, documentation, and the evidence of Meridian's attempted cyber intrusion. Agent Harrison reviewed the materials carefully. Mr. Chen, based on this evidence, it appears that you were the victim of an elaborate fraud scheme. Richard Blackwood was planning to use his niece to establish false ownership of your intellectual property, then sell the company based on assets he knew he didn't control. What happens now? Now we build a case against everyone involved in the conspiracy. Richard Blackwood, several executives at Meridian Financial, and potentially others. You'll likely be called as a witness, but you're not a target of the investigation. As I left the federal building, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders that I hadn't even realized was there. The legal cloud hanging over me was dissipating, and the truth about Richard's fraudulent scheme was finally coming to light. My phone buzzed with a text from Tom Rodriguez. Board voted unanimously to remove Richard as CEO. Quantum Dynamics stock halted pending SEC investigation. Company may file for bankruptcy protection. I stood on the courthouse steps, looking out at the city where I'd built my career, and felt a strange mixture of vindication and sadness. Quantum Dynamics had been a good company once, with good people trying to build something meaningful. Richard's greed had destroyed all of that, but out of the wreckage, something new was about to emerge. My phone rang, another New York number. Mr. Chen? This is Michael Stevens from Goldman Sachs. We understand you have some revolutionary financial technology that might be available for licensing. Now that the legal issues surrounding quantum dynamics are being resolved, we'd like to schedule a meeting to discuss a potential partnership. As I walked away from the federal building, I realized that getting fired for refusing to train Richard's incompetent niece had been the best thing that ever happened to me. The $850 million empire that Richard had tried to build on stolen technology was crumbling, but from its ashes, something much bigger was about to rise. The countdown was over. The real work was just beginning. 6 months later, I was standing in the penthouse boardroom of the Goldman Sachs building in Manhattan, looking out at Central Park while some of the most powerful people in global finance discussed the future of money itself. The irony wasn't lost on me. 6 months ago, I'd been escorted out of a Seattle office building like a criminal. Now, I was about to sign the largest technology licensing deal in financial services history. Marcus, said Jennifer Walsh, Goldman's Chief Technology Officer, before we finalize the numbers, I want to make sure we all understand the scope of what we're discussing. Project Phoenix isn't just an improvement over existing payment systems, it's a complete paradigm shift. She was right. Over the past 6 months, while Richard Blackwood sat in federal prison awaiting trial and Quantum Dynamics liquidated its assets in bankruptcy court, I'd been working with the best engineers and financial experts money could buy to refine Project Phoenix into something that surpassed even my wildest original vision. The system we'd built could process not just individual transactions, but complex, multi-party financial instruments across multiple currencies and regulatory frameworks simultaneously. Where traditional systems took days to settle international transfers, Phoenix could do it in under 60 seconds with mathematical certainty of completion. The preliminary testing results speak for themselves, I replied, pulling up the holographic display system that Goldman had installed specifically for this presentation. Phoenix has processed over $2.3 billion in test transactions across 14 different banking networks with 0 failures, 0 security breaches, and an average processing time of 847 milliseconds. David Kim, who'd been sitting quietly at the far end of the table, smiled. Over the past 6 months, he'd transformed from a small practice patent attorney into one of the most sought-after intellectual property lawyers in the country. Representing me had made his career, but more importantly, our friendship had deepened through the shared experience of taking down one of the biggest corporate fraud schemes in tech history. Gentlemen, ladies, David said, opening the contract folder, we're looking at exclusive licensing rights for Project Phoenix technology in the North American market for a period of 10 years. The base licensing fee is $1.2 billion, with additional performance bonuses that could bring the total value to $2.8 billion over the contract term. Michael Stevens, Goldman's managing director, nodded approvingly. And Marcus retains all rights to license the technology in other markets? Correct. We're already in advanced negotiations with the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, and 3 major Chinese financial institutions. Conservative estimates put the global licensing value at somewhere north of $8 billion. As I listened to David negotiate terms that would make me one of the wealthiest individuals in America, my mind wandered to the events that had brought us to this moment. The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of congressional hearings, media interviews, and legal proceedings that had completely transformed not just my life, but the entire landscape of corporate accountability in the tech industry. Richard Blackwood's trial had become a media sensation, dubbed the Silicon Valley Godfather case by CNN. The evidence we'd provided, recordings, emails, documentation of the fraudulent scheme, had been so overwhelming that Richard's legal team had eventually advised him to plead guilty to avoid a potential 20-year sentence. During the sentencing hearing, I'd been called to provide a victim impact statement. Standing in that federal courtroom, looking at the man who'd tried to steal my life's work, I'd felt something I hadn't expected: pity. Your Honor, I'd said, Richard Blackwood had the opportunity to build something truly revolutionary. He had access to technology that could have changed the world, the resources to develop it properly, and the talent to make it succeed. Instead, he chose greed, nepotism, and fraud. The real tragedy isn't what he did to me, it's what he did to the hundreds of employees who believed in quantum dynamics and lost their jobs because of his choices. Richard had been sentenced to 8 years in federal prison and ordered to pay $47 million in restitution to former Quantum Dynamics employees who'd lost their savings when the company collapsed. Jessica Blackwood Martinez had faded into obscurity after the scandal broke. According to social media posts I'd seen, she'd moved back to California and was working as a marketing coordinator for a small startup. To her credit, she'd never tried to blame me for her uncle's downfall or claim that she'd been unaware of his illegal activities, but the most satisfying outcome had been watching the broader impact of the case on corporate governance practices across the tech industry. Congress had passed new legislation requiring public disclosure of family members in key technical positions. The SEC had implemented stricter oversight of technology valuations in merger and acquisition deals. And several major tech companies had voluntarily adopted policies prohibiting nepotistic hiring for critical technical roles. Marcus? Jennifer Walsh's voice brought me back to the present. Are you ready to make this official? I looked around the table at the faces of people who, 6 months ago, would never have taken a meeting with me. Now they were competing for the opportunity to license technology that had emerged from the ashes of my former employer's corruption. Before I sign, I said, I want to share something with all of you. I pulled out my phone and opened a news article I'd bookmarked that morning. The headline read, Former Quantum Dynamics employees launch revolutionary fintech startup with $50 million in seed funding. This morning, 17 former Quantum Dynamics engineers announced the launch of Meridian Systems, not to be confused with the Meridian Financial that tried to steal our technology. These are good people who lost their jobs because of Richard Blackwood's fraud, and they've spent the past 6 months building something incredible. I looked directly at Jennifer Walsh. I'm licensing a scaled-down version of Phoenix Technology to their startup for free. They'll be competing directly with some of your clients, and their system will be almost as good as what you're licensing from me. The silence in the room was electric. Several of the Goldman executives exchanged worried glances. Marcus, Michael Stevens said carefully, that could significantly impact the value of the exclusive licensing agreement we're discussing. You're right, it could. But here's the thing, competition makes everyone better. Goldman Sachs licensing Phoenix Technology means you'll have the most advanced financial processing system in the world. But having competitors using similar technology means you'll have to keep innovating, keep improving, keep pushing the boundaries of what's possible. David. Kim was grinning broadly. We discussed this strategy beforehand, and he'd warned me that it was risky. But I believed that the best way to honor the good people who'd suffered from Richard's fraud was to give them the tools they needed to rebuild and compete. Besides, I continued, the global financial services market is worth about $25 trillion annually. There's room for more than one revolutionary technology. Jennifer Walsh laughed, a genuine, appreciative laugh. Marcus, most people in your position would be trying to create a monopoly. You're deliberately fostering competition. I learned something important over the past 6 months. Technology is only as good as the people who use it and the purposes they use it for. Richard Blackwood had access to revolutionary technology, but he used it for fraud and personal enrichment. I want to make sure that doesn't happen again. Michael Stevens nodded slowly. All right, Marcus. We appreciate your transparency and your principles. Goldman Sachs is prepared to move forward with the original terms. 2 hours later, I was officially $1.2 billion richer, with the potential for billions more as the technology rolled out globally. But as I stood on the sidewalk outside the Goldman Sachs building, looking up at the Manhattan skyline, I realized that the money wasn't what mattered most. What mattered was that I'd proven a point that had been eating at me for 6 months, sometimes doing the right thing, even when it's difficult and dangerous, leads to outcomes you never could have imagined. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah Montenegro, who'd landed a senior engineering position at Apple after Quantum Dynamics collapsed, saw the Goldman Sachs announcement on the news. Congratulations. Richard picked the wrong person to mess with. Then another text, this one from Tom Rodriguez, who'd started his own executive recruiting firm specializing in ethical hiring practices. The entire tech industry just learned a valuable lesson about what happens when you try to steal from a genius. Well done, Marcus. But the text that meant the most came from an unexpected source, Jessica Blackwood Martinez. Marcus, I know I probably have no right to contact you, but I wanted you to know that I understand now what my uncle was trying to do and why you refused to help him. I'm sorry for the role I played in hurting you and the other employees. You did the right thing. As I walked through Central Park toward my hotel, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. Getting fired for refusing to train an incompetent CEO's niece had seemed like the end of my career. Instead, it had been the beginning of something much bigger, not just financial success, but a chance to reshape how the tech industry thinks about ethics, accountability, and the responsibility that comes with revolutionary technology, the Phoenix. Technology that would soon power transactions for hundreds of millions of people around the world had literally risen from the ashes of corporate corruption. Every time someone used the system to send money to family, pay for goods, or conduct business, they'd be using technology that existed because I'd chosen principles over job security. 6 months ago, Richard Blackwood had offered me a choice: compromise my ethics or lose everything. He'd thought he was calling my bluff, but he'd never considered the possibility that losing everything might be the first step toward gaining something much more valuable. As the sun set over Manhattan, casting long shadows across the park, I made a mental note to visit Seattle the following week. There was a small coffee shop in Capitol Hill where I'd spent the afternoon after being fired, and I wanted to thank the barista who'd served me coffee while I sat there planning the downfall of my former employer. Some stories end with revenge. This one ended with justice, redemption, and the knowledge that sometimes the best thing that can happen to you is being forced to bet everything on yourself. Richard Blackwood had tried to steal my technology, destroy my career, and force me into submission through threats and intimidation. Instead, he'd given me the motivation and opportunity to build something bigger than either of us had ever imagined. The $850 million empire he'd tried to build on stolen innovation was gone, replaced by something worth billions and built on a foundation of integrity, innovation, and the simple idea that doing the right thing, even when it's difficult, ultimately leads to the best outcomes. As I walked back to my hotel, already planning the next phase of Phoenix development and thinking about the global impact the technology would have, I smiled at the irony of it all. Getting fired for refusing to train the CEO's niece hadn't just taken them down overnight, it had lifted me up beyond anything I'd ever dreamed possible. Sometimes the best revenge is simply becoming everything your enemies never thought you could be. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.